Hey, so 103, should we just go ahead and let's do it.
I think let's do it.
Let's get started. Okay,
Mhm.
so first thing I'm going to do is just introduce myself. I'm Ian Haney Lopez. I'm a law professor at UC Berkeley, specialized in critical race theory. I've really spent a lot of time studying racism in the United States, especially as it's evolved over the last 50 years. And in that context, I've really come to think about the main impetus behind racism as being class war, not racism in general, not white racism in general or cultural racism, but really the actions of specific individuals. Um, and I've written about that in terms of electoral politics, a 2014 book, Dog Whistle Politics. And then I started thinking, well, if that's the strategy against us, then what's the solution? And that led me to co-found Race Class Narrative Project and to continue working in the race class area, and now to put together this Race Class Academy. So this is what we're up to.
Awesome. And my name is Brittany. I'm a communications strategist calling in from Oakland, California today. And I specialize in the areas of racial justice and economic justice. I do a lot of communication strategy work for nonprofits. And fun fact, I met Ian about 5 years ago when I barged into his critical race theory class, even though I wasn't a student in the law school, and he graciously allowed me to stay. So
It's been downhill ever since then.
just a little housekeeping before we get started with the actual panel. We are going to have a few minutes at the end for questions from the audience, and you'll see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A button. So if you have a question, feel free to hit that button and put it there, and we will do our best to get to it at the end.
Cool. And just to give you a heads up, we're gonna, this is both informational in the sense of like, hey, here's race class, here's why it's important. But it's also pedagogical. Like it's also how to teach this stuff, how to talk about this stuff. Because really what we're doing here is providing a toolkit for you all to use both to deepen your own understanding of race class, but also so that you can have it as a resource, either in terms of conversations with friends and family and colleagues, or if you're an organizer, trainings within the organization, or using it as a basis for organizational outreach to others, right? So we're kind of operating on two levels. One is substantive and the other is, and how does this training tool work? Let me go ahead and get started. We're gonna go to this slide. I'm gonna talk about why race class. Then Brittany's going to talk about the thinking behind Race Class Academy. It's video based, and so today we're actually going to see 3 of those different videos. But let me start with why race class. And I have a bit of a sort of a presumptuous statement here, and that is that race class is a paradigm change. Here's what I don't mean that to sound grandiose. But I do mean to signal something important here. That is that race class challenges people to think differently than they typically do, both about racism and about class dynamics. So I'm coming out of a racial justice background, and from the racial justice perspective, and certainly the way I was trained and the way I thought and wrote for many years, I understood racism as fundamentally a conflict of racial hierarchy, a problem of white over non-white. That is a sort of an opposition between whites on the one hand and people of color on the other. But over the last decade, I've really come to realize that hierarchy is there, no doubt about it. But the greatest energy, the real resources pouring into it, and the real profits being extracted from racial hierarchy are actually being driven by a powerful few. And we can name them, and we should name them. The Trumps as a family, the Koch brothers, the Mercers, Roger Ailes, the talking heads on Fox News and Breitbart. They're making millions or billions by driving racism. And a lot of politicians are getting elected by driving racism. So This is a very different way of thinking about racism, not as fundamentally a conflict between whites and people of color, but as something that is driven for profit by some of the most powerful actors in our society today. And this is not just a different way of thinking about race. This is a different way of thinking about class. Most people who talk about class downplay the importance of race. They tend to say things like, well, class unites us because all working families need A, B, and C, whereas race divides us because once you start focusing on race, we get into all these conflicts over identity. Let's just focus on the class dynamics. And that's an enormous mistake because it fails to realize that the number one weapon being used by the rich is racial division. And so if you want to take on class war, if you want to lift people up and create routes of toward shared prosperity, you have to address racism. Now, I want to come back again to this word paradigm. When I say this is a paradigm change, I don't mean it's original. This is actually one of the oldest understandings of race in the United States. It's an understanding that goes back to Bacon's Rebellion in 1619, where enslaved Africans got together with enslaved Europe or unfree labor that was European. We'd call it a white and black movement now to rebel against the plantation class. It was the fusion movement right after the Civil War that linked emancipated African Americans with the poor whites. It's a vision that Martin Luther King articulated late in the civil rights movement, late in his life. I don't mean that this is original, but I do mean that most of us aren't thinking in these terms anymore. And once we understand that this is a challenge to our basic understandings of race and class, we see that this is going to require a lot of work to really get our heads around it. And so now to Brittany, that work.
Thanks. Brittany here again. So Ian just gave a really robust summary of the content that sort of inspired the Race Class Academy. Why an academy though? This is more of a vehicle for all of the concepts and history that Ian just described. And we wanted to make sure that it was rooted in sort of traditions of community organizing. And so you'll see throughout our presentation today, Ian will provide more context on the content. And I will be talking about different ways that people can actually learn this content and use it to connect with community members, friends, family members through our curriculum.
So let's get started. We are going to go on. We're going to start with this first video, and the idea here is to help illustrate the sort of paradigm change we have in mind. This is the first video in the series, and the goal of this video is to get people to understand that we're in the midst of a class war the rich are winning, and their principal weapon for the last 50 years and still today is racial division. Welcome to Race Class Academy. The goal is to explain ideas and insights that can help you work with others to build a multiracial progressive majority. Level 1, dog whistle politics. It's the main political weapon we face, and you can trace it to this man. In 1963, Barry Goldwater and his faction within the Republican Party wanted to return the country to a time when the government mainly worked for the wealthy. The previous time, corporate greed had tanked the economy and triggered the Great Depression. After that, we embraced the New Deal. We as a country understood that government must play an essential role in regulating corporations, creating ladders of upward mobility, and ensuring that economic winners pay their fair share. That's how we grew the largest middle class the world had ever seen. Goldwater campaigned against the New Deal, but he knew his economic agenda was unpopular, so he came up with an outrageous strategy. Here's what conservative journalist Robert Novak reported. Perhaps a majority of the party's leadership envisioned substantial political gold to be mined in the racial crisis by becoming, in fact, though not in name, the white man's party. The racial crisis? That was the civil rights movement. In fact, but not in name? Here's where Goldwater innovated. He would promote white supremacy, but do so using code. For instance, Goldwater would shout about law and order, as if he was talking about crime in general, rather than spreading the lie that black civil rights protesters were violent hoodlums. This is dog whistle politics. It allows politicians to promote social hatreds, especially but not only racism, while pretending they honor equality. Goldwater would lose, but dog whistle politics won. 1964 would be the last year a Democratic candidate for president would win a majority of the white vote. Next up, racism as a weapon of the rich. Cool. All right. So that's the video. A couple things I want to say about the video. All of these videos are under 2 minutes and 20 seconds in length, and we're doing that on purpose. We want these to be videos that people can share easily on social media. That's the Twitter imposed algorithm. People can share these. All of these videos are available on raceclassacademy.com. So one idea is keep it short so people can share it. Here's the other idea. Keep it short because these are such complex ideas. We want to be able to get people through it, but also give people a chance to digest it. Let me reiterate that this is the first video. This is the one where we're pushing people to recognize that we are in the midst of a class war being waged principally through racism. But now, how do we really get people to sort of develop their thinking on this? I'm going to kick it back to Brittany, and she's going to talk more about the vision for Race Class Academy in general.
Yes. Brittany again. So you just saw video 1.1, a reminder. There are 12 videos, 4 levels. And this is sort of the entrance to Race Class Academy level 1. We created this discussion guide, keeping in mind that people might be watching these videos over Zoom or with their friends and family, and we really wanted to make the content as accessible as possible. So what you'll see in the actual discussion guide is 3 types of content. First, you have building blocks, and those are really just the high-level concepts that everyone should walk away from the video having really taken in and understood. And then you have discussion questions and answers. This part of the guide is really customizable. You may find for one video you have anywhere from 5 to 10 questions, and you get to choose which questions resonate most with the group of people that you're actually experiencing the Race Class Academy with. And the role of the questions is to actually guide folks through conversation so they arrive at those building blocks and can really confidently say they understood the content of the videos. And the last type of content is something we're calling anti-racist pro tips. You'll see within the discussion guide that along the way, we leave little crumbs of what we feel are tips to help people navigate authentic and very difficult conversations about race. You'll notice that there's a lot of use of dog whistles in the curriculum because we're actually trying to call that out and name names, but it can get a little bit uncomfortable sometimes when you're sort of referencing that in conversation over and over again, for example. And so we have tips on how to do that and arrive at a conversation where everyone feels like they're taking away from it what they need.
Yeah, and let me just add here, the discussion guides are framed at one level as if what they are is an aid to people who want to talk about this with others. But we actually have a sort of an ulterior sort of sense of what's happening here. I think a lot of people, the way race class works, on one level, you get it very quickly. And this is why race class as political messages are the most potent political messages out there right now. They're the best way to beat racial fear messages. They're stronger than the sort of standard progressive responses. But at the same time, right, like if people really get it, we're being divided, we need to come together. At the same time, it's hard to know what that means. What is the role of liberal government? Why do the wealthy hate it so much? How does dog whistling work? How can people simultaneously trigger these responses in others and yet pretend that they're not racist? And why would anybody believe them? And what we're expecting is that people will look at the discussion guides saying to themselves, well, I want to think about how to talk about this with others. But in the process of figuring that out, they're actually deepening their own education, right? So the discussion guides are sort of, you know, here's questions that you might ask and answers you might give, but partly it's here's the education process. Okay, let me, Brittany, anything else? Otherwise, off we go to the next one.
Let's go to the next video.
Cool. All right, so this is the next video. I'm coming back to this idea that race class is a paradigm change. To me, this is one of the most important ideas that race class, a lot of people understand race class as a very successful messaging technique. Well, here, let me be honest about something. Race class is a messaging technique that says, hey, we need to bring white people into a cross-racial movement. And a lot of folks react to that by saying any effort to bring white people into cross-racial movement is somehow accommodationist or not radical, or in order to do that, we're going to have to appease whites or pander to them or tamp down on our racial justice commitments. And I want to make clear, I came to race class because I see it as actually the most promising route toward racial justice. And it's the most promising route towards racial justice, not on a pragmatic, this is how we get white people to buy in level, though there's that. It's because for me as a race scholar, as a critical race scholar, race class gave me the best understanding of the systematic government violence against communities of color that has arisen over the last half century. And so this is one of these key ideas that I really want to push people to grapple with. Let's watch the video.
The United States has less than 1/20th of the world's population, but we have almost 1/4 of the world's prisoners. And this isn't just mass incarceration, it's racialized mass incarceration. It overwhelmingly targets Black and brown communities. It's true, policing has deep roots in racial oppression and even slavery, but there's something else going on here too. Look at this chart. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, something creates in the nation a rage to imprison. That something is dog whistle politics. For the last 50 years, politicians from both parties, mainly Republicans, but Democrats too, have been campaigning by using dog whistles about law and order, crime and crime victims, thugs, and super predators. And then they build prisons. Dog whistles don't stay on the campaign trail. They become militarized police in our neighborhoods and prisons across the land. And this isn't just a story about racialized mass incarceration. When politicians stoke fear of terrorists, they govern through mass surveillance against Muslim communities here at home and through torture and endless war against Muslims abroad. When they warn about illegal aliens, they build the machinery of mass deportation and rip families apart at the border. Here's the bottom line. Over the last 50 years, on many different fronts, the government has engaged in systematic violence against communities of color. The reason for this is not white racism in general, it's dog whistle politics in particular. This is the difference between racism as hate and racism as a strategy of the powerful. Up next, does the success of dog whistle politics mean we're a country of bigots?
Okay, so that video for me is it's incredibly important because I think, you know, we're in the midst of what by some measures is the largest protest movement in the history of the country. In terms of the number of protest actions, in terms of the number of protest participants, the protests we're seeing in support of the movement for Black lives over the last couple of months is the largest protest movement in the history of this country. And it's a protest movement geared towards lifting up government violence, lifting up to condemn government violence against communities of color. And in so many of our conversations, we think about that violence as having its roots in racial oppression, having its roots in slavery, having its roots in Jim Crow, and all of that is right. That's where the roots are. But more specifically, starting in the late 1960s and then accelerating with a vengeance in the 80s and the 90s, politicians, Republican and Democrat, began campaigning using messages of racial fear and then turning around and giving those messages of racial fear concrete form in terms of prisons and bloated police budgets. And when we think about police violence and the sort of the murder of Black and Brown and Native American murder against people in Black and Brown and Native American communities, part of it is a culture of racism in police forces. I get that. But part of the reason there's a culture of racism in police forces is because that's who our politicians have asked our police to become. That's who they've funded them to become. Right? The violence being waged against communities of color is directly rooted in a class war being waged through messages of racial fear. And I want to emphasize this as an analytic point. Simply to understand what's happening, we have to look at the way in which class war is driving efforts to harness government into a weapon of oppression against communities of color. But now I also want to say, and this is what's so important about the Race Class Academy as cumulative, as one building block on top of the other. Once we see that, then later on it will become easier to see why a race class approach is actually a promising route towards both racial justice and economic fairness. Okay, we're gonna go on and back to Brittany.
Yes. I just want to make one other note about what you were just saying. As I'm watching sort of videos from level 1, it occurred to me to point out that what you're getting today is really a lot of the rich foundational structure of the Race Class Academy. And as the videos progress, I think you find yourself really asking questions about how all of these things apply to your life in particular. So I just wanted to call out that, like, I know that this is a lot of history, and also it evolves over the arc of the Race Class Academy. So what we're looking at right now is the virtual house party toolkit. And I just want to go back to the idea of Race Class Academy being a part of a paradigm change and being a tool for consciousness raising, because I think this is what this toolkit gets at. The inspiration behind it is we started thinking, what are the most effective aspects of organizing, of community organizing? Obviously, with COVID-19, that's going to change a lot about how we connect with people, but we wanted to be adaptable. So we created this digital toolkit to allow us to get on with the work of civic engagement. So virtual house parties are a play on, a house party, part of the 6-week campaign. Things that have a long history in the tradition of community organizing. And this is accessible because it's sort of like a book club, except instead of reading books and then talking about it with your friends, you're watching videos together and then talking about it. So it really does remain person to person, even though we can't be face to face right now. And I think that in addition to the discussion guides, the digital house party toolkit really gives folks a sense of empowerment. This is the journey that you go on with watching the videos and then learning the content. And then maybe you're able to teach the content. And hopefully someone in your small circle of friends is going to carry this to another circle of friends. So that's just sort of the thinking behind the virtual house parties to go along with the videos.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Brittany. Back to this is back to Ian. I think the virtual house parties, it's also, we really envision organizations using this material to do internal trainings, to guide internal conversations, and then we also want to hold up the power of deep canvassing. you know, for example, I've participated a bit with People's Action, which is doing some amazing work, doing deep canvassing, using race class messages. That you know, and I know that a lot of different organizations were gearing up to running big deep canvassing campaigns, and it seems those are no longer possible. Many organizations have shifted to text messages, and then from there to phone calls. This can be the next step. You know, once you've been talking to somebody on the phone, say, hey, do you want to join a sort of a book club / virtual house party and have conversations about race class? And it's a way to build community, and it's a way to understand what's happening to us. So we're really hoping that organizations themselves will pick this up. Brittany, I'm going to volunteer Brittany. Brittany would love to hear from you.
I would. It's actually true.
But so, you know, we've got these scripts, we've got these discussion guides, but we're happy to work with organizations to collaborate and develop material that will be most helpful to them. Could be focused on economics, could be focused on racial justice, could be within the labor movement. But we really do feel like this is a resource that we want to hand out to make available to organizations.
Since you said that, I'm dropping my email in the chat.
Oh, good, good. All right. I want to also take a look at this video. This is the last video I'm going to show, and as part of the way in which we intend the Race Class Academy to push people to provide a resource that people can really use to revisit, to provide a vocabulary, to name what's happening.
Ronald Reagan got his start in politics stumping for Barry Goldwater, and then he went on to achieve Goldwater's dream, not just becoming president, but using dog whistle politics to help society's wealthy. Majorities still wanted government to regulate corporations, build ladders of upward mobility, and ensure that the rich paid their fair share. So how to make this sort of liberal government the enemy? Like Goldwater, Reagan would use racial stories. He railed against welfare queens ripping off the system. He aimed with this to trigger racist stereotypes that framed people of color as lazy and larcenous. But he also wanted voters to hate liberal government, in this case for supposedly wasteful giveaways paid for by our taxes. Let's call this Dog Whistle's scarcity script, except that resources are scarce and blame government for giving to supposedly undeserving people of color while taxing supposedly hardworking whites. Reagan also repeatedly complained about government doing more for criminals than for crime victims. Call this the threat script. Fear people of color and hate government for coddling them while not protecting whites. We often think of dog whistle politics as exclusively about race, but it is also centrally about demonizing liberal government. Stripped of the code, here's the basic dog whistle story. 1. Fear and resent people of color. And so 2. Hate liberal government. And 3. Trust the marketplace. Trusting the supposed freedom of the marketplace is what remains when you see government as threatening and fear your neighbors. Now let's be clear. The top 1%, they don't hate government. Rather, they want to run it for themselves. The economic consequences of this are devastating. Indeed, the real source of scarcity in our lives. But up next, what happens to communities of color when dog whistle politicians run government? In other words, the real threat story.
So what I want to highlight there is, you know, this effort to give people a vocabulary and a lens through which to evaluate the sorts of stories they're hearing all the time. Dog whistling has 2 basic stories, a scarcity story and a threat story. Under the scarcity story, that's one that says, hey, the reason you can't get health care is because it's going to those undeserving illegals, or, you know, because people without insurance are flooding the hospitals. And the problem is the government keeps coddling them while taxing you, the hardworking taxpayer. These stories are highly racialized, but when people accept them, they blame people of color, they turn against government, they turn against these sorts of government programs necessary to building routes of upward mobility and shared prosperity, and they end up supporting market solutions. Or a threat script. The threat script says implicitly people of color are violent, and it can talk about thugs or criminals, it can talk about illegal aliens, it can talk about terrorists. Then it turns around and says, but the real danger in our lives comes from government, because it's government that refuses to control people. And this is all that rhetoric about government doing more for criminals than crime victims, or government leaving the borders open, or sanctuary cities. Frankly, in the Second Amendment context, it's the conversation about gun regulation. That's connected to a rhetoric that says people of color are dangerous. Implicitly, government's not protecting you, you need to buy a gun. And then government not only is not protecting you, it's coming to take your gun, right? And you see gun sales booming, not only when Barack Obama's elected, but you see gun sales booming right now. At moments of social crisis, the right is promoting a story that says your neighbors threaten you, government betrays you, you're on your own. The economic version of that is trust the marketplace. The sort of physical, social version of that is buy a gun. You need to defend yourself against your neighbor, right? And so this is the push to say, have in mind these basic structures so that as the details change, people are empowered to recognize these different scripts and then to push back against them. Okay, I think Brittany, it's so important what Brittany said. To clarify, this is level 1. These are the videos, dog whistle politics, using dog whistles to undermine government, government violence against people of color, a country of bigots. That's the first level. Next week, we'll have the videos live for level 2. Level 2 really thinks through the standard progressive responses that push back against dog whistling. And we should be clear, history tells us they're not working. So we need to understand why not. One of the first responses is the call them racist responses. The call them racist responses ends up backfiring precisely because dog whistling comes across as common sense, not just to the majority of whites, but to the majority of people of color as well. And what has happened with, and then there's a video that's specifically talking to the race left, and it's saying to the race left, and this was honestly the most personal video for me, it's saying to the race left, if you move forward on a model in which whites and people of color are locked into a basic conflict, yes, moral appeals can bring some whites onto the side of racial justice, but most will remain opposed. If that's the only alternative, either stay silent about racism or challenge white racism in a way that alienates many whites, I'm with the racial justice folks that say we got to challenge white racism. But the insight of the race class approach is we can actually challenge racism in a way that illustrates to whites that their best chance for a decent life is to fight racism. Their best chance for a decent life for themselves and their white families is to fight racism against Black and brown people. That's the possibility of a race class approach. So this is really talking to the race left. And then there's a couple of messages here, a couple of videos to the class left. Now the class left are the folks who are saying, race divides us, class issues really bring us together. There's a centrist version of that says, hey, we can talk about minimal things, but we really have to avoid talking about race. We lose white voters when we talk about race. There's a more radical version of that says we really want economic populism and a sort of a complete redistribution of wealth. But whenever we talk about race, that divides us. There is, to be honest, an environmental version of that, a version of that says we face an incredible crisis in terms of impending climate collapse. Let's focus on that. Let's not get distracted by social justice and racial justice issues. This class left video is actually going to talk about the environmental movement and that tendency to say we can get what we want by setting race to a side. And the truth is, racism is the main weapon of the rich against all of us. And you cannot win the fight against corporations and the rich by going colorblind and ignoring race. And then the last video there is identity politics. Again, this is a move among many, frankly, among many whites who say identity is a thing that subordinated communities have, whether it's people of color or women or gays and lesbians or on and on and on. No, identity is something we all have. And indeed, the three most important questions in terms of how people engage in politics: who am I in this society? Who threatens me? Who are my allies? And we should be crystal clear, the right is addressing those questions all the time. It's saying to whites, you in this society should be valued and esteemed because you made this country great. But right now you're threatened by these violent, undeserving people of color who don't respect and indeed want to change your culture. And your allies are the people who understand and respect you as whites, and the people who make it possible for you to compete in the marketplace and to buy a gun because you're on your own, right? That's the right story. What is the progressive story about who we are, who threatens us, and who our allies are? That's what race class is doing. So then we get to level 3, the race class story, really saying, who are we? We're people who have shared values no matter what race or color we are. Who threatens us? Powerful elites stoking division so that they can hijack government and rig the economy for themselves. Who are our allies? Everybody who will come together with us to build power and make sure the government works for all of us, right? And so then, but from there, I want to go deeper, really take seriously the idea of interest convergence. Interest convergence is a notion that comes out of critical race theory. It says you cannot win big advances in racial justice unless significant segments of the white population see that racial justice is good for them too. And historically, that's been a critique. It's a way to understand the Civil War and the end of slavery, which was not Lincoln's original agenda, but was forced on him by the need to recruit African Americans onto the side of the North to help fight and win that war. It's part of the story of Brown versus Board of Education and the country's turn against Jim Crow segregation. But interest convergence is also a way of saying, wow, over the last 50 years, fighting racism really has become in the primary interest of whites. That's the only way they're going to get their pensions back. They're going to get decent jobs back. They're going to get healthcare, right? So it takes interest convergence seriously. The last video in this series is social solidarity. This is really aimed at whites and at white liberals. And it's saying, you know, there's a way in which race class sounds comfortable. It sounds like suddenly we're going to start talking about racism as something that hurts all of us. And we don't have to talk about white privilege and we don't have to talk about reparations. Wrong. Social solidarity is hard work. It has to be real work. This has to be a multiracial movement that is genuine, that genuinely embraces racial egalitarianism and racial equality. And we cannot get there. We cannot build this powerful multiracial movement unless whites engage with questions of white privilege and unless whites commit to reparations. But now the reason to do so is not simply moral, it is pragmatic. What we're saying to whites is to save yourselves, deal with white privilege, deal with reparations, heal these divisions so that we can create a powerful movement that takes care of all of us. And the last level on this, is it possible? Is it possible now? And this is really a way of taking that conversation about whiteness and deepening it and saying, we need to be realistic that for centuries, being white supremacy has been in the material and psychological interests of many white folks. That is changing. It is changing partly because of, you know, the power of the racial justice movements. It's changing partly because the ugliness of white pride is so clearly on display in the Trump era. It's changing because whiteness itself has been weaponized against white people by powerful economic elites. Our job is to make that clear, right? And so this is to sort of give you a sense of the scope and the depth of the Race Class Academy. And I think we're gonna, oh, one other, Brittany, you wanna, I'll hand it back to
Here's
you. I've
our
been
team.
chattering. This is the team.
So this is our team. Obviously, Ian and I are present today. Also, shout out to Jake Kornbluth, who produced all the wonderful videos, 3 of which you saw today. Jake is also known for producing the Inequality for All documentary and Saving Capitalism by Robert Reich. I just want to, before we move on, Ian, connect back to something that you were saying when you were walking through the rest of the material. The reason why I'm so excited about Race Class Academy is because as a millennial, as a queer Black woman, as someone who has spent many years in the nonprofit sector, I have attended many sort of racial equity trainings or diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings. And I think that there is a sort of tendency to make those trainings very comfortable for white progressives at the expense of sort of people of color in the room who have some of that background already. This is different. And the reason it's different is because A, I myself actually learned, I got more historical context out of these videos. And B, I find comfort in the fact that because I know I'm going to come to this material and sort of struggle through it and get what I need out of it as a person of color, but I also think it does that for white folks as well. And I think that's one of the key components of trying to build this sort of cross-racial solidarity is that there are going to be moments of discomfort for all of us. But if we can sort of struggle through that understanding together, we're more likely to achieve our end goal.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think that there's in some ways, race class is immediate. You know, the studies we've done, the message testing we've done show how powerful it is. People get it. And on another level, it's really hard. It's really hard. And it's making big demands on, frankly, on white liberals who haven't taken racism seriously. They now have to grapple with the idea. I mean, what would it really mean for many progressive organizations that have not thought that they were engaged in the fight for racial justice to understand that the number one roadblock between them and whatever it is they want to achieve, environmental justice, good schools, adequate food, right? The number one goal between them and whatever they want to achieve is racial division as a way of breaking our confidence in government and allowing reactionary elites to run government for themselves. That, I mean, that would be revolutionary if you had institutions, the Sierra Club to name one, that said, we want to save the environment. The number one thing we have to do is fight racial justice or fight racial division. And likewise, I think this is going to be a challenge for racial justice folks. A lot of racial justice folks are, with good reason, deeply skeptical about white allies, right? There's a sense of like, hey, integration was never really integration. It was tokenism. White allies are comfortable only as long as, you know, we're supporting their movement, but do they really show up for our movement? All of that skepticism is real. And yet, here's a paradigm change that says the best route to big advances in racial justice is to make clear to people that whiteness is a danger to all of us, no matter what our color or racial position, right? These are challenging conversations, but we're also hopeful that there's sort of like, that the Race Class Academy allows people to engage in these conversations in a sustained way, right? Not just in a watch a video or listen to a message, but to really grapple with, argue with, debate with others. What does this mean? What does this imply? I think we're gonna transition to questions. I'm gonna stop screen share and all of a sudden we'll be, right? And if you have questions, please type them in the chat. Oh, sorry, not in the chat. In the Q&A.
We have one here. So we'll start. Karen Gaffney says, "This is great, thank you. I'm wondering if you both think that there's a certain demographic of white people that is more open to this paradigm shift. For example, while poor whites get demonized, are you thinking they would be more open to this work than middle class or upper class whites, or younger whites versus older whites, or whites living in certain regions?"
You know, one thing we should be clear about, like People's Action has been incredibly successful in talking to rural whites, many of them, most of them working class, and saying to them, look, you know, you're being urged to blame everything that's going wrong in your lives on Black people and Latino immigrants. But the truth is, look at who wins when we divide against each other. And that's been very, very successful. Some stunning results they presented earlier are really, if you haven't looked at their results, you should really look at it. At the same time, Power California has been using a race class message to try and organize in urban California. That's mainly young people of color, but it's also a lot of young whites. And again, they're seeing a very, very powerful, very positive responses among young whites in California. So I don't think it's a sort of a demographic cohort sort of distinction to begin with. I would say the number one question is, what sort of information environment are people in? Are they steeped in the world of Fox News and Breitbart? Are they steeped in the racial, cultural resentments of many white evangelical churches? Those are going to be the hardest folks to reach. This is not a sort of a panacea. It's like, we're going to promote a message of cross-racial solidarity and everybody's going to join hands and sing. That's not going to happen. But a race class message, when we test it, this can reach high 50s, 60% of whites, much higher percentages of people of color. In other words, we can use race class to create a supermajority, numbers around 58, 59, 60%. That's electorally. The larger ambition is over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, getting sufficient political power so that we can harness government itself, as well as major social institutions like foundations and unions, schools and universities and churches, to recommit to a purposeful effort to build solidarity, right? Like, what the right has done for 50 years is they've invested heavily in shattering our sense of connection to each other. Whereas progressive organizations have done very little to actually create a sense of linked fate across all of these various forms of division we face. That has to be this longer project, and we need a certain amount of political power before we can really reinvest in the project, for instance, of using schools, public colleges, higher education, public service programs, things like a civilian conservation corps, to rekindle the idea that the only way we function as a democracy and the only way we have an economy in which all our families can thrive is if we believe our fates are linked.
Thank you. Let's check the Q&A box. So while we wait for a few more questions to come in, I have a question.
Okay, cool.
I know that Race Class Academy is sort of rooted and grounded in some research that you began doing a few years ago, right? I'm wondering if you could give us an overview of what the highlights were from that research that would be relative to someone who's wanting to do this work.
Yeah, so this is really coming out of the insight that if the main impetus behind racism today is actually greedy elites, mm-hmm. that creates a different possibility of how to respond. It creates an allegiance where whites and people of color have a shared interest, not the same interest, but a shared interest in joining together to fight racism. For whites, it's the interest of taking power back from powerful elites who are running government and the economy for themselves. For people of color, it's the interest partly in taking government back so that we have economic opportunity, but in addition of building a coalition that's powerful enough to drive from office dog whistle politicians who are using government as a source of violence against communities of color, right? So that was the insight. And the question was, would it work? And so a few years ago, I co-founded the Race Class Narrative Project with Anat Shenker-Osorio and Heather McGee, and we ran some message testing, and we found that in fact it's the most powerful message. I've just completed updated race class narrative message testing focused primarily on Latinx communities, but with large oversamples of African Americans and whites as well. The number one message today is cross-racial solidarity, believing in each other. Actually, let me frame it here. Let me frame it this way. I said the three most important political questions are, who are we? Mm-hmm. Who threatens us? Who are our allies? So the race class message says, we are people who believe in each other and believe in racial equality. Who threatens us? Greedy elite sowing division. Who are our allies? Other people who will join with us to make sure government works for us and not for corporations. That's the most powerful political message available right now today. This message is going to be everywhere in terms of what's happening in 2020, but also what's happening over the next decade or next 2 decades, as we're on the cusp. We are now increasingly a multiracial society. The open question is, can we be a multiracial democracy? And this is really the conversation we're all having.
So we have maybe 3 minutes left. And let me check again. No questions, but I want to see if I can sneak in one more. Because you just hinted at like this being a, Race Class Academy itself, but also just like the work of building cross-racial solidarity. You hinted at that being not just a project that ends on November 3rd, 2020, right, but that goes on for decades. So I'm wondering if you see that, how do you see the Race Class Academy evolving?
That's a really great question. Someone in the Q&A just said, can you repeat the 3 questions? So this is going to be part of the Race Class Academy, but it's incredibly important that we all understand that most people do not engage in politics by asking themselves, what are my policy preferences and which politician comes closer to supporting my policy preferences? That's just not how most people engage, not even the most educated voters. Instead, people are asking themselves, sometimes consciously, but mainly unconsciously, who am I in this society? How am I viewed? What's my position? Am I respected? Am I marginal? Like, who am I? Who threatens me? Who are my enemies? Where is the source of danger in my life coming from? And who are my allies? Who will help me against those dangers? And now, if those questions are important in general, think about how important they are where we find ourselves today. We're in the midst of a pandemic that has been grossly mismanaged by our government, by the federal government, and as a result of which we're really we're in plague conditions with society shutting down. Connected to that, the economy for most people is shutting down, although the rich are doing very, very well if you look at Wall Street and the sort of the profits of the billionaires. And we're in the midst of some of the largest social protests we've seen in the history of this country talking about social injustice. These are a series of interlocking crises. And in the context of crisis, people especially want to know, whose fault is this? Who threatens me? Who am I here and who are my allies? And so race class is really engaging forcefully in those questions. It is saying, we're all in this together. And the most important route forward is for us to build a sense of connection with each other. The people who threaten us are powerful elites who understand that the only opposition to money power comes from people power. And because they know that, they spend a lot of money breaking people power by breaking our sense of connection to each other. And what that means is we all have to do the hard work of coming together so that we can reclaim government for us rather than the corporations, right? And this isn't, I mean, partly this is, you know, hey, we got to win an election, or we got to participate in elections. And yeah, partly it's that. But more than anything else, this is a praxis. This is something, a new way of thinking about what's happening to us, and something that we have to put into practice in many different ways, in creating connection across division, in building bridges to other groups, in doing the hard work to allow ourselves to engage in a process of setting aside skepticism, creating opening, trusting others. All
Sorry,
of this
Ian, I
is,
don't mean to break in, but we have less than 60 seconds left. And I just want to make
all
sure
of
to
this
say
is a
one
long
more time.
project.
RaceClassAcademy.com. You can find the videos, the discussion guides, the 3 questions that we use to decide what our politics are going to be. Thank you so, so much for everyone who attended. And please reach out with questions. My email is in the chat.
And thank you, Brittany. You've been awesome. And thank you to Netroots for hosting us, and have a great Netroots 20.
Thank you.